The morning Phineas Finley rode onto the Mercer homestead. The sun had barely cracked the horizon, and the dust of the Kansas plains was already rising in golden columns around his horse's hooves. And yet Evelyn Mercer was already standing in her doorway with a rifle balanced across her forearm like she had been expecting trouble for years and had simply decided to meet it head-on. She had, in fact, been expecting exactly this sort of trouble. Not him specifically, but men like him. Men on good horses with clean boots and folded paper in their breast pockets. Men who represented something larger and more dangerous than themselves. Men who came offering fair prices for things that could not be fairly priced. It was the autumn of 1878, and the plains of central Kansas were changing faster than the grass could grow back after a drought. The railroads had pushed through. The cattle drives were threading northward like long brown rivers, and the land agents were following behind both of them, picking up the pieces that desperation left behind. The Mercer homestead sat on 160 acres of solid bottom land near a creek that ran clean even in August, and that made it worth considerably more than most people knew. Evelyn knew. She had dug that creek bed herself to widen it for irrigation, had broken every inch of that soil with her father's old mule before the mule died, and had kept every record of her labor in a leather journal that sat on the kitchen table beside a lamp she lit every evening whether she was reading or not, simply because the light made the house feel less empty. Her father, Raymond Mercer, had died 14 months ago. A fever that came fast and left nothing behind but debt and silence, and a homestead that was paid for but barely producing. She had one hired hand, an older Mexican man named Aurelio who came 3 days a week and never asked to be paid more than he was worth, which she respected enormously because almost everyone else she met seemed to believe they were worth more than they delivered. She had 2 milk cows, a small kitchen garden, a half-acre of winter wheat that was coming in crooked, because the seed had been poor quality and she hadn't been able to afford better, and 160 acres of possibility that she had not yet fully figured out how to turn into reality. She was 26 years old and she had not given up on anything yet, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. Phineas Finley was 31. He worked for a land acquisition company out of Wichita called Hargrove and Sons, which was neither owned by anyone named Hargrove nor involved any sons, but was instead a real estate concern run by a man named Aldous Crew who had a talent for buying land cheaply and selling it expensively, and who had the sort of smile that made you check your pockets afterward. Phineas had worked for Aldous Crew for 4 years. He had been good at the work, or at least efficient at it, which was not quite the same thing, and he had told himself for 4 years that the prices he offered were fair because the market dictated them, and the market was not his invention. He was beginning to wonder about that. He had a good horse, a bay gelding named Cornet, who was steady and sensible and required no drama from the world around him, which Phineas appreciated more than he admitted. He had a clean shirt and a decent hat, and a document in his breast pocket that represented an offer of $420 for the Mercer property, which Aldous Crew had told him was more than generous. Phineas had looked at the creek bed survey and thought it was perhaps not generous enough, but Aldous Crew was not the sort of man who revised offers upward without a compelling reason, and $420 was the number he had been sent with. He reined Cornet to a stop about 30 feet from the porch and took off his hat, because his mother had raised him right even if the rest of his life hadn't always followed her example. "Miss Mercer," he said, "my name is Phineas Finley. I'm with Hargrove and Sons out of Wichita. I've come to speak with you about your property if you're willing." Evelyn did not lower the rifle. She looked at him with eyes the color of creek water in shadow, a sort of gray-green that changed depending on the light, and she assessed him the way she assessed the weather, which was to say carefully and without sentiment. "I know who you are," she said, "or what you are anyway. 3rd man they've sent this year." Phineas hadn't known that. Aldous Crew had not mentioned previous attempts, which said something about Aldous Crew's management style and also about why Phineas had been sent now, after the others had presumably failed. "I'm sorry to hear there's been a pattern of bothering you," he said, and he meant it, which surprised him a little. "I won't be more trouble than necessary. But I have been asked to present an offer, and I think it's only fair to you to present it honestly so you know where things stand." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. She had expected the same script the others had used, apparently, and he was already off it. "You can tie your horse at the post," she said. "I'll hear what you have to say. But I want you to know before you come up on this porch that I have heard everything before, and I have said no every time, and the answer is going to be no again. I just want to be polite about it." "I can respect that," Phineas said. He tied Cornet at the post and climbed the 3 steps to the porch, and she moved aside just enough to let him see the interior of the house through the open door, which told him she was not afraid of him, only watchful. There was a kitchen table visible with a lamp and a journal and 2 coffee cups that suggested she had been awake long enough to drink at least 2 cups already. There were curtains on the windows that had been made from flour sacking and dyed a faded blue that was somehow not sad but simply practical and honest. And there were shelves along one wall that held canned goods and books in equal number, which told him more about her than anything else could have. She gestured to a chair on the porch and sat in one herself. The rifle leaned against the wall beside her, still within reach but no longer pointed at anyone. "Coffee," she said. "If it's no trouble. It's already made." She went inside and came back with 2 cups, and he noticed that she moved through her own space with the kind of ease that comes from owning something not just legally, but in the deepest sense, the way a person moves through a place they have built and know and intend to keep. It made the document in his breast pocket feel heavier than it had before. He told her the offer. $420, clear title, 60 days to vacate. She listened without interrupting, her cup held in both hands, her eyes on the middle distance where the prairie opened up in its enormous amber expanse. Then she was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Finley," she said, "that creek bed alone is worth $200 to any farmer who understands what he's looking at. The full bottom land with winter water rights ought to be closer to 700, and I think you know that." He did know that. He had run the numbers himself and come to approximately the same conclusion, which was why the offer had felt wrong when Aldous Crew had handed it to him and felt worse now. "The company's offer reflects current market conditions," he said, and he heard how empty that sounded even as he said it. She looked at him directly then, and there was no anger in her face, only a kind of weariness that was not defeat but something older and more considered, the weariness of someone who has fought the same fight many times and knows all the moves in it. "Does it?" she said. It was not really a question. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and looked out at the land himself, at the way the autumn light was running gold and long across the grass, at the dark line of the creek bed in the middle distance and the cottonwood trees along it that were going yellow at the tops. It was fine land. He had seen a great deal of land in 4 years of this work, and this was among the finest he had stood on. "No," he said. "Honestly, it doesn't." She was quiet. "I'm supposed to tell you that it does," he said. "I'm supposed to talk to you about the instability of single-ownership farming in the current economic climate, and about the opportunities available to you in town, and about how the railroad expansion is going to change land values in ways that might make it harder to sell later. Those are the arguments I was given. And are you going to make them?" "I don't think so," he said. "I don't think you're a woman who needs to be handled, Miss Mercer, and I don't think I'm the right man to try it." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across her face and disappeared. "That's honest of you. I'm sorry to have wasted your morning." "You haven't wasted it," she said. The coffee was going to get drunk either way, he laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, like water from a crack in dry ground, and it seemed to surprise her too because she looked at him as though she was seeing something she hadn't anticipated. "What will you do," he asked, "if you don't mind my asking, with the place? Long term?" She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I've been thinking about cattle," she said. "Not a big operation, 20, 30 head. Use the creek access for water, use the bottom land for wintering hay. There's a rancher to the east who I think would let me run my animals with his on summer grass for a small fee. It's a thin plan right now, but it has a shape." "It's a good shape," he said, and he meant that too. She studied him for a long moment. "You're a strange sort of land agent, Mr. Finley. I've been told." He rode away that morning having failed his assignment in every measurable way, and he felt better about failing it than he had felt about succeeding at anything in recent memory, which told him something he wasn't quite ready to fully examine. He got back to the small boarding house in the town of Caldwell, where Aldous Crew had put him up, wrote a report that said the owner was unwilling to sell at the offered price, and that the property was likely worth more than the offer reflected, and sent it by post to Wichita. Aldous Crew would be displeased. Phineas found that he could tolerate Aldous Crew's displeasure more easily than he could tolerate the image of Evelyn Mercer standing in that doorway with her rifle and her flour-sacking curtains, and her very clear assessment of what her land was worth. He did not expect to go back. He had no professional reason to. But 2 days later, he found himself in the general store in Caldwell buying flour and salt because the boarding house cook was insufficient, and he heard 2 men talking at the counter about the Mercer place. And what they were saying was not the kind of thing that a decent person could hear and then walk away from without consequence. The men were talking about a water dispute. Apparently a man named Gerald Stout, who ran a cattle operation about 3 miles north of the Mercer homestead, had been diverting the creek upstream since August. The diversion was not massive, but it was deliberate, and it was ongoing, and it had reduced the water flow to the Mercer property by roughly a third. Stout had the money and the local connections to make any legal dispute difficult. The county land office was, according to the men in the store, not particularly interested in the concerns of a single female homesteader, when Stout was paying taxes on 1,200 acres and drinking whiskey with the county commissioner. Phineas bought his flour and his salt, and he stood outside in the autumn wind and thought about this for some time. The wind smelled like dry grass and distant rain, and Cornet was tied at the rail looking patient and philosophical. He rode back to the Mercer homestead that same afternoon. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when he came up the lane, pulling the last of the autumn squash from their vines, and she stood up and watched him come with an expression that was more curious than guarded now, though the guardedness was still there underneath, the way bedrock is always there underneath the soil. "Mr. Finley," she said, "you've come back." "I have, not on company business." She pulled off her gardening gloves and tucked them into her apron pocket. "Then what sort of business?" "The kind where I heard something in town that I thought you ought to know about, and I couldn't think of a good reason not to tell you." He told her about Stout and the water diversion. He watched her face as he spoke, watched the way her expression moved from mild curiosity through something harder and more complicated, and he could see her doing calculations in her mind, the kind of calculations that people who live close to the land are always doing, running figures of water and yield and winter stores. "I know about the diversion," she said, when he finished. Her voice was steady, but there was something tight behind it. "I've been to the land office twice. They told me to document it. I've been documenting it. They told me to come back with more documentation. It's like they keep moving the fence line on me." "Do you have a lawyer?" She gave him a look that said everything that needed to be said about her current budget for legal representation. "I have a friend in Wichita who studied law," he said. "He's practicing now. He's honest and he's good, and he has a strong opinion about water rights being what the law says they are, not what the powerful man in the county says they are." "Why would you do that?" she said. "You came here 2 days ago trying to buy my land for your company. Why would you help me keep it?" It was a fair question, and he didn't have a clean answer for it. He thought about the clean boots and the document in his breast pocket and the 4 years of efficient work for Aldous Crew, and he thought about the way the light had looked on this land 2 days ago, and the way she had looked at him when he had told the truth instead of the script. "Because the offer I brought you was too low and I knew it," he said. "And because what Stout is doing is wrong, and I know that too. And I suppose I've been in this work long enough to want to do one thing that sits right with me." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen garden was quiet around them, the dry squash vines rustling in the wind, a single crow calling from the cottonwoods down by the creek. "All right," she said. "What's your friend's name?" His friend was a man named Thomas Ellers, who was practicing law in Wichita in a small office above a dry goods store, and who had very strong opinions about water rights and frontier justice, and the tendency of powerful men to rewrite the rules to suit their own purposes. Phineas wrote to Thomas that evening from the boarding house and explained the situation in full, and Thomas wrote back within the week to say that the law in Kansas regarding riparian water rights was actually quite clear, and that Stout's diversion was almost certainly in violation of it, and that if Miss Mercer could document the diversion adequately and provide a survey of the original creek course, he believed a complaint to the district court would produce results. Phineas brought the letter to Evelyn on a Friday morning, and she read it twice, and then she looked up at him with something bright and determined in her face that was not quite hope, but was the thing that makes hope possible. "I have the documentation," she said. "All of it. 14 weeks of water level measurements, dated and described. Thomas said that's exactly what he needs." She set the letter down on the kitchen table beside her lamp and her journal. "You've done something kind for me, Mr. Finley. I don't take that lightly." "I didn't do it to create an obligation," he said quickly. "I know you didn't. That's what makes it kind." She paused. "Would you like to stay for supper? I have a pot of beans on and cornbread in the oven, and I think you probably shouldn't ride back to Caldwell on an empty stomach." He stayed for supper. And then he stayed while she showed him the documents she had been keeping, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and organized everything into the form that Thomas would need. And at some point she made more coffee, and somewhere in the middle of the second cup, she stopped being Miss Mercer to him and started being Evelyn, which she must have noticed because she started calling him Phineas somewhere around the same time. He rode back to Caldwell in the dark, which was a foolish thing to do on the Kansas plains in October because the coyotes were active and the road was not well marked. But he felt lit from the inside with something that made the dark feel navigable, something that had been missing from his life for long enough that he hadn't entirely remembered what it felt like until just now. He wrote his resignation letter to Aldous Crew that night. It was not an impulsive decision. He had been thinking about it for weeks before he ever rode to the Mercer homestead. He had just needed, apparently, something to resign toward rather than simply resigning away from. Aldous Crew did not take it gracefully, which was consistent with his character. He sent a letter back within the week that was both insulting and threatening, implying that Phineas had acted against company interests and that there might be professional consequences. Phineas read this letter, folded it carefully, and used it to start the fire in his boarding house grate, which was the most appropriate disposition he could think of for it. He had some money saved. Not a great deal, but enough to be useful for a season. He had skills that were relevant to this country, including a working knowledge of land surveys and water rights and agricultural economics that, applied honestly rather than in service of a company with Aldous Crew's ethics, might actually be of use to people in this part of Kansas. He stayed in Caldwell. He found a small office above the barber shop where he could work as an independent land and property surveyor. He had the credentials for it and the tools for it, having acquired both in the course of his work for Hargrove and Sons, and within a month he had enough work from local farmers and homesteaders to pay his rent and his horses' feed and leave a little over. He went to the Mercer homestead on business that he invented when he ran out of real reasons, and he went when he had real reasons too, and the distinction between the two kinds of visits blurred gradually over the weeks of November as the Kansas autumn went cold and the first hard frosts arrived. Thomas Ellers filed the complaint against Gerald Stout in the district court in early November. Stout hired a lawyer of his own, a man from Topeka who charged more per day than most homesteaders earned in a month, and the case moved slowly, the way legal matters did in 1878 when the courts were overworked and the land disputes were plentiful. But Thomas was thorough and persistent, and Evelyn's documentation was meticulous, and gradually the weight of evidence accumulated. In the meantime, Evelyn was managing the winter on her own, which was no small thing. Phineas found himself helping, first with small, obvious things like repairing a fence section that was leaning badly in the northwest corner of the property, and then with larger things, and she let him help without making it a charity or a debt, which was a quality he had not known to look for in a person until he found it. They talked about everything. That was the thing that surprised him most. He had expected, given her guardedness, given the rifle and the assessing look and the clear understanding of her own worth that she had demonstrated from the first morning, he had expected a woman who was careful with herself. And she was careful. But careful and closed were not the same thing, and once she trusted him, which happened so gradually that neither of them could have said exactly when it was complete, she talked to him the way he had always wanted to talk to someone, which was honestly and at length and about things that actually mattered. She told him about her father, who had come to Kansas with her mother in 1869, when Evelyn was 17, part of the great wave of homesteaders who had taken the government at its word about the Homestead Act, and had arrived on the plains with hope and very little else. Her mother had died of typhoid 3 years later, in 1872, and her father had kept the place going on determination and stubbornness until the fever took him in 1877. She had been keeping it going on the same two qualities since then. She told him about the loneliness, which she described not with self-pity but with the precise vocabulary of someone who has examined a thing thoroughly. "It's not that there's no one around," she said, one evening in November when the fire was going and the wind was making the windows rattle. "There are neighbors. There's the church in town when the weather permits. It's more that there's no one who is specifically interested in what I am thinking, and I am often thinking something, and there's no one to think it at." He knew exactly what she meant. He had been thinking things at no one in particular for years. He told her about growing up in Ohio, about working on the railroad survey crews when he was 20, about how he had ended up in land acquisition work by a series of small practical decisions that had accumulated into something larger than he had intended. He told her about the discomfort that had been growing in him for years, the sense that the work he was doing was not wrong in any dramatic or obvious way, but was quietly wrong in the way that many ordinary things are quietly wrong, slowly and accumulatively, and in ways that are easy to ignore until something makes you stop and look at what you've been part of. "The land is being taken," he said one evening, staring at the fire. "Not just bought and sold. It's being taken from the people who broke it open and made it livable, and the mechanism is legal and the process is orderly, and it looks very different from what happened to the tribes, but the underlying logic is the same. The powerful acquire what the less powerful built, and they use the law to do it, and the law was written by the powerful so." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "My father knew that," she said. "He used to say that the government gave us the land with one hand and left the door open for it to be taken back with the other. He didn't know exactly how it would happen, but he knew the door was open. He was right. A lot of people are right about things like that, and it doesn't help them much." "No," Phineas said. "It doesn't. That's the injustice of it. Being right doesn't protect you." "What protects you, then?" He looked at her across the firelight. "Stubbornness, apparently, and good documentation." She laughed, and the laugh was one of the best sounds he had ever heard, warm and unguarded and entirely itself. He was falling in love with her. He had known it for weeks in the way that you know things when you are being honest with yourself. And he did not do anything about it because the situation was what it was, and he was not going to complicate her life with his feelings before she had invited them. December came with the first real snowfall of the season, which came in hard and fast from the northwest, and covered the plains in 2 days of white quiet that made the world feel like it had been simplified down to its essentials. Phineas rode out to the homestead the morning after the snow stopped because the road was passable, and he wanted to make sure the fence he had repaired was holding, and because he had a sack of provisions from the general store that he had been meaning to bring out anyway, and the snow gave him a practical reason. She was on the porch when he came up the lane, her breath clouding in the cold air, looking at the snow on the prairie with an expression that was difficult to read but was not unhappy. She turned and watched him come, and there was something in her face in that unguarded moment, something that he saw before she knew he was close enough to see it, and it made the cold air feel suddenly very warm. "You didn't have to come out in this," she said. "I had provisions to deliver. You're a very practical man, Mr. Finley." She had slipped back to the formal address, but it was playful now, with a quality underneath it that was something other than formality. "Phineas," he said. "Phineas," she agreed and smiled. They spent the morning doing the winter chores, which Aurelio was unable to manage in the snow, and in the afternoon they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, because the snow-gray light through the windows was insufficient, and she showed him a letter she had received from Thomas Ellers about the progress of the case against Stout. Thomas had obtained a surveyor's report confirming that Stout's diversion work had been constructed on a portion of the creek course that was clearly within the riparian rights of the Mercer property. He had also found 2 other homesteaders upstream who had been affected by the same diversion and were willing to provide statements. The case was now strong enough that he expected a ruling before spring. "He's good," Phineas said. "He's very good," Evelyn agreed. "I owe you for sending him to me." "You owe me nothing. Thomas took the case because it was worth taking. He took it for a very reasonable fee because you vouch for me," she said. "That's not nothing. Everything in this world moves on connections and vouching and who knows who, and you spent your connection on me when you didn't have to. I noticed these things, Phineas." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and the snow-quieted afternoon, and he thought that she was the most clear-eyed person he had ever met. The way she noticed things, and called them by their right names without embellishment and without diminishment. And he realized that what he felt for her was not only the warmth of proximity and admiration, but something much older and more foundational, the specific gravity of recognizing someone who you could trust with everything. Which was not a feeling that came often or perhaps more than once. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I want to be honest with you about something." She was very still. Outside, the snow was doing something soft and sourceless that was not quite wind and not quite falling, a kind of general suspension of winter light. "All right," she said. "I came here in September to try to buy your land for a company that didn't deserve it and at a price that wasn't fair. That's where this started. I want you to know that I know that, and I know it's an odd beginning, and I'm not pretending it was something different. I know what it was," she said. "What I've felt since then has nothing to do with that work," he said. "It has to do with you specifically, and with who you are and what you're doing here and what you've made of this place and what you intend to make of it. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know where I stand, not because I expect anything from it." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "Phineas," she said, "I have been thinking about where you stand for about 3 weeks now. I want you to know that." He let out a breath. "I'm careful," she said. "I've had to be. I don't trust easily and I don't move fast, and I've been on my own for a long time, and I'm used to it in ways that aren't entirely comfortable to give up. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I know." She looked at him steadily. "That's part of why I've been thinking about it." He reached across the table and she let him take her hand, and it was not a dramatic gesture, but it was the most significant gesture he had made in years. And she looked down at their hands on the table, and then back up at him, and the smile that came onto her face was slow and certain, and entirely unlike the careful half-smiles she had offered before, and it transformed her in a way that was not a revelation about her beauty, which he had been aware of for weeks, but a revelation about her happiness, which he had been hoping to see. They were in love by Christmas, which came quietly to the plains that year with the creek half frozen and the cottonwoods standing in their white silence, and the stars so large and close on the cold, clear nights that you could almost hear them. Phineas spent Christmas Day at the Mercer homestead, which had never been done before, which they both understood without stating it, and Evelyn made a goose and dried apple pie and Aurelio, and his wife Maria came over in the afternoon with tamales, and a bottle of mezcal that they had been saving for a special occasion, and there was warmth and food and fire, and the particular kind of happiness that comes from a table full of people who have chosen each other. He asked her in January. He had not planned it for January particularly. He had thought he would wait until the stout case was resolved, until things were more settled, but they were sitting on the porch on a Sunday afternoon in a brief spell of winter sun that made the snow-covered prairie gleam like something precious, and she was reading and he was watching the light on the land, and the question simply arrived in him fully formed and entirely clear, and he had learned enough in the last few months to trust what was clear. "I would like to stay here," he said. "I mean here specifically, on this land." She looked up from her book. "I would like to stay on this land with you if you'd have me," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me, Evelyn. Not to solve a problem or provide a convenience, but because I don't want to be anywhere else in the world that isn't where you are." She set the book down very carefully on the porch railing, the way you set something down when you need both hands free. "Your surveying work," she said. "You do it from here, from Caldwell." "There's enough work in this county and the neighboring ones to keep me busy," he said, "and I can help with the cattle plan. I know a few things about land and water management that might be useful." She looked at him for a long time. The winter sun was warm on the porch boards and the prairie was immense and white and still around them. "Yes," she said. "I would very much like to marry you, Phineas Finley." He kissed her then, which was the first time, and she kissed him back, and it was exactly as honest and clear and unhurried as everything else about her, and the winter sun stayed warm on the porch all afternoon as if it was cooperating. They were married in March of 1879, in the small white church at the edge of Caldwell, which was barely big enough to hold the people who came. Thomas Ellers rode down from Wichita, which was a day's journey, because he considered himself partly responsible for the whole thing and wanted to witness what he had helped set in motion. Aurelio and Maria were there, and a half-dozen neighboring homesteaders who had gotten to know Phineas over the winter through his surveying work, and had taken a liking to him for reasons that seemed to boil down to the fact that he gave honest assessments, and did not charge more than he said he would. The minister was a thin, serious man named Reverend Caldwell, no relation to the town founder, who conducted the ceremony with appropriate gravity, and then stayed for the cake, because he had strong opinions about dried apple cake. Evelyn wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, cream-colored with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar, and she walked down the aisle looking like something the Kansas spring had made, deliberate and unhurried and entirely certain of where she was going. Phineas stood at the front of the church in a clean dark coat that he had bought in Wichita, and felt simultaneously overwhelmed and more completely at ease than he had felt in years, which was a paradox that made perfect emotional sense. They said the words carefully and meant every one of them. The stout case resolved in April of 1879, which was excellent timing, and which Thomas had partly engineered by filing a motion for expedited hearing on the grounds that the ongoing diversion was causing ongoing agricultural harm during the critical spring growing season. The district court judge, a methodical man from Emporia named Judge Hazard who had a deep personal dislike of riparian rights violations, found in Evelyn's favor and ordered Stout to remove the diversion structure within 30 days and restore the original creek course within 60 days. Stout was angry about it, which was expected. He rode over himself one April morning, a big red-faced man on a horse that was too fine for him, and he stood in the lane of the homestead and said things that were not polite and were also, given that Phineas was standing on the porch with his arms folded, somewhat ill-advised. "You ought to tell your woman to take the money when it's offered," Stout said to Phineas, which was the single worst thing he could have said. "She's not my woman," Phineas said calmly. "She's my wife. And her name is Evelyn Mercer Finley, and she just won her case in the district court, and the judge's order is clear, so you have 30 days to begin the work. I'd start counting." Stout had more to say, but Evelyn had come out onto the porch by then with her expression at its most expressionless, which was, Phineas had learned, considerably more threatening than anger, and Stout chose discretion over continuation and rode away. They watched him go. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I meant every word of it. I know you did, that's why I said thank you." The diversion was removed by May, and the creek ran full again by midsummer, and the water flowed across the Mercer land as it had before, and the kitchen garden did better that summer than it had in several years, and the winter wheat came in straight and full, because Phineas had found a better source of seed, and they had put it in together the previous autumn, working side by side in the October fields with the prairie horizon going orange and vast around them. They bought 12 cattle in the spring of 1879, with the combined resources of her homestead income and his surveying earnings and a small loan from the Caldwell Bank, which was willing to lend to them as a married couple in a way it had not been willing to lend to Evelyn alone, which was an injustice they both noted and neither could solve immediately, but intended to remember. The cattle were a mix of Texas Longhorn and Shorthorn Cross that had been trail-driven up from the south, and they were hardy and stubborn, and Evelyn took to managing them with the same meticulous attention she applied to everything, learning their individual temperaments and naming them in a system that Phineas found both impractical and entirely consistent with her character. The rancher to the east, a quiet man named Wallace Prout, who had watched the Stout case with interest and had formed a favorable opinion of the Finleys as a result, agreed to the arrangement about summer grass that Evelyn had been thinking about since before Phineas first rode onto the property. He charged them a fair fee, and it was a good arrangement for both parties, and it expanded into a friendship over the course of the summer, with the Prouts and the Finleys having supper together every few weeks and talking about cattle and weather and the changing shape of the Kansas plains. By the autumn of 1879, 1 year after Phineas had first tied Cornet at the hitching post and climbed those 3 steps with a document that he was already doubtful about, the Mercer homestead, which was now called the Finley place by most of their neighbors, though both of them privately kept calling it the Mercer place in the way that you keep using a name that has history in it, was running well and running honestly, and beginning to accumulate the modest surplus that they had both been working toward. In November of 1879, Evelyn told him she was expecting. He was at the table going over the cattle accounts when she told him, and he set the pen down and looked at her, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at him with that careful expression she had when she wasn't sure how something would land, the expression she rarely used with him anymore, but this was a large enough piece of news that the habit came back. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice did something he didn't entirely control. "March, I think," she said. "Maybe April." He got up from the table and crossed the kitchen and took both her hands in his, and she looked up at him, and the expression on her face opened into something that was relief and joy and a particular kind of wonder, the wonder of someone who has lived carefully and practically for long enough that an abundance of feeling is briefly startling. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm completely well. I just wanted to tell you." He held her face in his hands, gently, the way you hold something irreplaceable, and she leaned into it, and they stood in the kitchen in the November afternoon light, which was low and golden, and came through the flour-sacking curtains that she still had not replaced, and Phineas thought that there was nothing in the world he would change about this moment. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was hard. The plains went bitterly cold in January, a cold that came in from the north and settled down like a weight, and the cattle required constant attention, and the water in the creek troughs froze every night and had to be broken every morning, and Evelyn was moving slowly by February because the baby was well along, and she was tired in the deep cellular way that is different from ordinary tiredness. Phineas did the morning chores in the dark, in temperatures that made his breath freeze on his collar, and he did the evening chores in the dark too, and in between he managed the surveying work that kept coming despite the weather because the county was still growing, and land disputes did not pause for February. Evelyn managed the house and the accounts, and the planning for spring planting with the kind of competent, unflappable efficiency that he had learned was simply her baseline way of operating in the world, and she did it sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and her journal open and the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders that she had taken to wearing in the late evenings. And she looked so exactly right in that setting, so entirely herself and so entirely present in her own life, that it hit him sometimes coming in from the cold, the sight of her in the lamplight, like something physical. Their son was born on a Tuesday morning in late March of 1880, which was a cold, bright morning with the first tentative green appearing in the grass along the creek. He arrived after a long and exhausting labor attended by Maria, who had a great deal of practical experience with these matters, and managed everything with calm efficiency, and by a doctor from Caldwell named Dr. Perkins, who was competent and kind, and who Phineas respected very much by the time the morning was over. The baby was healthy and loud, and had a remarkable quantity of dark hair and hands that were surprisingly large, as though he had been designed for work from the beginning. Evelyn held him in the lamplight while the March sun came up through the bedroom window, and she looked down at him with an expression that Phineas had never seen on her face before, which was not surprising because it was an entirely new kind of love she was experiencing, the specific vertical love of a parent for a child, which operates on a different axis than any other. "He needs a name," she said. "He does." "I was thinking Raymond," she said, "for my father." Phineas looked at his son, who looked back at him with the unfocused intensity of a newborn, and thought that Raymond was exactly the right name for him. "Raymond Finley," he said. "Raymond Finley," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. "My father would have loved this. He would have been so happy." "He'd have been proud of you," Phineas said. "He'd have been extremely proud of you." She looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes, which was the second time he had seen her cry, the first having been the night in December when she had told him about her mother, and the way her mother had taught her to make dried apple pie because she knew she was sick and she wanted Evelyn to have the recipe forever. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, which was something she did now without thinking, and Raymond Finley looked up at the ceiling of the bedroom with his dark eyes and seemed to find it satisfactory. The spring and summer of 1880 were the best they had had. The water ran strong, the cattle were doing well, the winter wheat had been excellent, and Wallace Prout had introduced Phineas to a cattle buyer from Kansas City who was looking for reliable small producers with consistent quality, which opened up a market for them that made the cattle operation significantly more viable than it had been. Phineas's surveying business continued to grow. He had developed a reputation in the county and the neighboring counties for the same quality that had characterized his conversation on Evelyn's porch that first September morning, which was for giving honest assessments even when the honest assessment was not what the client hoped to hear. This was, somewhat paradoxically, very good for business, because people who needed to make real decisions about real land discovered quickly that an honest assessment was worth considerably more than a flattering one. He hired a young assistant in the summer of 1880, a 20-year-old named Daniel Birch, who had come to Kansas from Missouri with his family, and who was quick with numbers and careful with instruments, and who was going to be excellent at the work. Phineas spent a great deal of the summer teaching Daniel the things he had learned, not just the technical aspects of surveying but the ethical ones, which he considered equally important, and which Daniel seemed to understand without needing much convincing, because Daniel had grown up watching what happened to people who were surveyed dishonestly and had strong feelings about it. Evelyn was back to full capacity by summer, moving through the property with her characteristic efficiency, managing the cattle and the garden and the household accounts, and Ray, as the baby was quickly coming to be called, with the coordination of someone who has always had too many things to do and has made peace with it. She had also, quietly and without making a particular production of it, begun to help two neighboring homesteader women who were in situations similar to her own prior situation, specifically dealing with pressure from land agents and legal complications that they didn't have the resources to navigate alone. She helped them the way Thomas Ellers had helped her, with specific practical guidance and with the kind of attention that made people feel that their situations were understood. Phineas watched this happen and said nothing about it for several weeks because he didn't want to make her self-conscious about it, but eventually he told her that he thought what she was doing was important and that he thought she had a talent for it. "I just know what it feels like to be in that position," she said. "And I know what difference it made to have someone who knew the actual facts of the law and wasn't trying to profit from the situation. That's all I'm providing." "That's a great deal more than all," he said. She had written to Thomas Ellers twice on behalf of neighbors, and he had responded each time with the same thorough, practical helpfulness that he had offered to Evelyn. And Thomas had started to mention that he was thinking about whether there might be some way to formalize this kind of work, a kind of rural legal advocacy for homesteaders, something that didn't exist in Kansas in 1880, but that he thought the territory needed badly. Letters went back and forth between Caldwell and Wichita all through the fall of 1880, and by the following spring, Thomas Ellers had written a proposal that he sent to two different charitable organizations in the East, and by the fall of 1880, one of them had funded a small pilot program. Evelyn was not involved in the formal operation of this program, which was Thomas's work, but she was, as Thomas always told people when he described how it had started, the original reason he understood it needed to exist. In the autumn of 1881, when Ray was 18 months old and showing every sign of being a child of enormous will and specific opinions about everything, Evelyn told Phineas that she was expecting again. This time she told him over supper, casually and directly in the middle of a conversation about winter feed costs, which was entirely consistent with her character and which he loved her for completely. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired already," she said. "But good, strongly good." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and Ray, who was sitting in his chair observing all of this with the alert attention he gave to everything, said something that was not yet quite a word but had the cadence of an opinion, and both of them laughed. Aldous Crew came back into their lives briefly and unpleasantly in the early spring of 1882, not personally, but in the form of a letter to the county land record's office challenging the water rights ruling from the Stout case on an obscure procedural ground. It was the sort of legal maneuver that was designed not to win, but to create expense and uncertainty for the party being challenged, and it had Aldous Crew's approach written all over it even though his name did not appear on the document. Thomas Ellers identified the procedural challenge for what it was within a week, and wrote a response that was so thorough and so precisely targeted that the challenge was dismissed before Evelyn even fully understood what it had been. Thomas charged a small fee for this work that Phineas paid from the surveying account, and when he told Evelyn what had happened, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "He's trying to soften us up again." Stout must have sold his interest to Crew's company. "That's what Thomas thinks too," Phineas said. "What happens next? Thomas thinks they'll try one more time through proper channels with a higher offer, and when we say no, they'll move on to easier targets. There's enough land in this county that they don't need to fight for one parcel that has active legal representation." "Good," she said. "Then we say no very clearly and that's the end of it." They said no very clearly, through Thomas, in the spring of 1882, and Aldous Crew's company moved on, and that was indeed the end of it. Their daughter was born in June of 1882, on a hot, still morning when the prairie was vivid green from a recent rain, and the creek was running high and clear, and the cattle were in the east pasture in the early light, and everything was very beautiful and very alive. She was a small, precise baby with Evelyn's gray-green eyes and a composure that she seemed to have arrived with fully developed. They named her Clara, which had been Evelyn's mother's name, and which Evelyn had been holding in reserve for years without fully knowing why. "Clara Finley," Evelyn said, holding her while Ray stood at the bedside looking at his new sister with an expression that moved between fascination and suspicion in rapid alternation. "She's small," Ray said. He had recently acquired a working vocabulary and was using it constantly, inserting observations at every possible opportunity. "You were small too," Evelyn told him. "I'm big now," Ray said with absolute conviction. Phineas lifted him up so he could see better, and Ray studied his sister with the gravity of someone forming a considered opinion, and then nodded as though he had reached a provisional conclusion that was open to revision. "Hello, Clara," he said. Clara Finley blinked at her brother with those gray-green eyes and appeared to find him acceptable. The years after that were years of building, which is the most accurate word for what that kind of life is, the steady accumulation of what you have worked for, the slow becoming of what you intended to be. The cattle operation grew carefully, never faster than they could manage it well. By 1884, they were running 30 head, and had established enough of a relationship with the Kansas City buyer that their prices were reliable. Phineas had expanded the surveying business to include land valuation work for the Caldwell Bank, which was more complex work than straight surveying, but suited his skills and his commitment to honest assessment. Ray grew with the kind of speed that children achieve on the plains, nourished by fresh air and productive labor and parents who talked to him as though his thinking mattered, which it did. By the time he was 5, he was useful around the property in specific practical ways, and by the time he was 6, he was following Phineas on easy survey jobs and learning to look at land the way his father had been taught to look at it, which was as something that had its own nature and deserved to be understood on its own terms. Clara grew with equal speed but in a different direction, oriented toward her mother in a way that was not passive dependence but active apprenticeship, watching how Evelyn managed the accounts and planned the planting and wrote the letters and helped the neighbors, and doing a child's version of all of it with the small, dedicated composure she had arrived with. In the spring of 1885, Thomas Ellers came to visit from Wichita, which he had been doing annually since the wedding, bringing news of the legal advocacy work and the latest developments in Kansas land law and his own life, which had recently and happily come to include a woman named Frances who was a schoolteacher in Wichita and who was, Thomas said, the most practically intelligent person he had ever met, which was saying a great deal, given Thomas's general admiration of practically intelligent people. He and Frances came together on this visit, and Frances and Evelyn, meeting for the first time, had the immediate recognition of two people who think in the same key. And within the first afternoon of the visit, they were deep in conversation about things that ranged from prairie agriculture to territorial politics to the education of children in frontier communities. And Phineas and Thomas sat on the porch and listened to the conversation through the open window with the contented appreciation of men who had both been lucky enough to find the right person. "How are things really?" Thomas asked, which was his way of asking the thing beneath the surface. "Good," Phineas said. "Really good, Thomas. Not without complication, not without hard work, not without bad seasons, but built on the right foundation." "She's remarkable," Thomas said. "I know it," Phineas said. "I've known it since September of '78, standing on that porch trying to buy her land for a number I knew was wrong." Thomas smiled. "Best failed sales call in the history of Hargrove and Sons. Only one with a decent outcome." They drank their coffee and listened to the voices inside the house, and the late spring prairie moved in its slow green waves toward the horizon, and Cornet, old and steady and gray around the muzzle now, stood at the hitching post in the afternoon sun looking philosophical and satisfied. Wallace Prout died in the summer of 1885, which was a loss. He had been a quiet, fair-minded man who had never asked for more than he was owed, and had always delivered what he promised, which were qualities rarer than they should have been on the plains. His widow, Agnes Prout, was capable of running the ranch but wanted to scale it back, and she came to Phineas and Evelyn in August with a proposal that she sell them 30 additional acres of Prout land adjacent to their northeast fence line, land that included a particularly good stretch of creek frontage. The price was fair, genuinely fair this time, the kind of price that comes from two parties who respect each other and are not trying to extract anything from the transaction except a fair exchange. They bought it. It required every bit of available savings and a small additional loan from the bank, and it was the right decision in a way that was immediately obvious as soon as the ink was dry on the paper, the way the right decisions feel. The expanded property, now 190 acres of bottom land and creek frontage, changed the scale of what was possible. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the cumulative way that good land changes what is possible for the people who work it, season by season and year by year. Evelyn planted a proper orchard on the new Prout acres in the autumn of 1885. 12 apple trees, 4 pear trees, 2 plum trees, all varieties selected for hardiness in the Kansas climate, chosen from a catalog she had been studying for 2 years. She planted them herself, with Ray helping and getting in the way in approximately equal measure, and she staked each tree and mulched its base and walked the line of them afterward in the low autumn light, looking at what was there, and what would be there in 3 years when the trees began to bear. And Phineas watched her from the fence line, and understood that she was seeing the future as clearly as she was seeing the present, which was one of the things about her that had never stopped being astonishing to him. He walked over and stood beside her in the line of small staked trees. 3 years for apples, she said. Worth waiting for. Everything worth having is, she said, and glanced at him sideways with something warm in the corner of her expression, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the same way she had been leaning into him for 6 years now, with the ease of someone who has found the right place to rest. The winter of 1885 to 1886 was the hard winter, the one that people on the Kansas plains would talk about for a generation afterward. The temperatures went to unprecedented depths in January and stayed there for 3 weeks, killing cattle by the thousands across the region and devastating operations that had expanded too fast or too thin. Phineas and Evelyn lost 6 head, which was painful and costly, but they had not overextended, and they had wintered their remaining animals in the barn with adequate hay, which they had laid in heavily in November on Phineas's assessment of the likely severity, an assessment based on the migrating bird patterns, and the way the grass had gone down in October, and the reports from the northern settlements that came through the mail. They came through the hard winter damaged but intact. Others were not so fortunate. Phineas spent much of the spring helping neighboring families assess their situations, doing pro bono survey and valuation work for people who needed to understand what they had left and what their options were. And Evelyn wrote more letters to Thomas Ellers that spring than she had written in any previous year, because the number of people facing predatory land purchase offers in the aftermath of the hard winter was very high, and many of them needed the kind of help she knew how to direct them toward. Agnes Prout was one of the people most severely affected, having lost nearly half her remaining cattle in the hard winter. She sold the rest of the Prout ranch in the spring of 1886 to a cattle operation from Texas that was moving into the region, and moved to Wichita to live with her daughter. The parting was kind and a little sad, and Evelyn packed her a basket of the last of the winter preserves and walked with her to the wagon, and they embraced on the road with the spring wind moving the new grass around them and said what needed to be said. The children grew. Ray, at 6 years old in 1886, was his father's companion on survey work and his mother's helper with the accounts, a child who was most alive when he had a specific task, and who approached everything with the focused seriousness that both his parents recognized, though in him it had a particular quality that was different from either of theirs, something that was entirely and distinctly his own. Clara, at 4, was beginning to read with a fluency that surprised everyone, including the schoolteacher in Caldwell, who came twice a week to the homesteads in the area, and she had developed very precise opinions about the livestock, particularly the horses, and spent a great deal of time in the barn explaining things to the animals in a patient, low voice that was a small echo of her mother's. Evelyn was expecting again by the spring of 1887, which she announced at the supper table with the same calm directness that she brought to all important information. "Another one," Ray said, with the forthright assessment of a 7-year-old. "Another one," Evelyn confirmed. "Good," Ray said, returning to his supper. "Clara needs someone to argue with besides me." Clara, who was across the table, looked at her brother with an expression that said she found this characterization inaccurate but was choosing not to engage with it at the present time. Phineas looked at his wife across the supper table, and the lamp was lit as it always was in the evenings, and the children were talking now in the way that children talk at supper tables when the world is basically right, with the unedited confidence of the deeply secure, and he thought that this was the thing he had wanted without knowing he wanted it. The specific texture of this particular life, not a grand life, not a famous life, but a life that was built honestly and inhabited fully and shared with someone who saw it clearly. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." "That's very helpful," she said, but she was smiling. Their second son was born in November of 1887. A big healthy baby who arrived in a hurry and announced himself loudly, and spent his first hours exercising a set of lungs that were clearly more than adequate. They named him George, for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Ray inspected him with the authority of experience and declared him satisfactory, and Clara held him with the careful exactness of someone who takes new responsibilities very seriously. And George Finley looked at the world from his mother's arms with an expression that suggested he found it promising and intended to explore it thoroughly. By 1888, the Finley place was 10 years from the morning that Phineas had ridden up the lane for the first time with a document in his pocket that he knew was worth less than the land it described. It was a different place from what it had been then, and it was the same place entirely, which is the way it is with things that grow organically from what they were intended to be. The cattle herd was at 35 head now, managed with the same meticulous care that Evelyn had applied to the original 12. The orchard on the northeast acres was bearing its third year of fruit, the apple trees heavy in autumn with more than they could use themselves, which had led to a modest but profitable cider-making operation that Phineas had set up in the old tool shed, and that Ray, now 8, considered his personal domain. The surveying business had expanded enough that Daniel Birch was now a full partner, running the southern part of the county while Phineas managed the north and west. The homestead had been modernized in the small ways that were possible in central Kansas in 1888, a proper wooden floor in the main room, a cast-iron cookstove that was significantly more efficient than the original, a proper ice cellar dug into the hillside behind the barn that kept things cold through the summer. The flour-sacking curtains were still at the bedroom windows. Phineas had offered, at various points over the years, to replace them with proper cloth, and Evelyn had said each time that she was not sentimental about them, but that they worked perfectly well, and she saw no reason to replace something that worked perfectly well, which was such a perfect expression of her general approach to the world that he had stopped offering. Thomas Ellers and Frances married in 1886 and came to visit with their son, a year-old boy named Henry who was, according to Thomas, the most opinionated infant in the state of Kansas, which may have been accurate. Henry and Ray were both old enough by 1888 to have formed the beginning of a friendship that consisted largely of trying to outdo each other at various physical tasks around the property, which Phineas and Thomas observed with the resigned amusement of fathers who recognized their sons' qualities reflected back at them. It was in the summer of 1888 that Evelyn wrote the piece. She had been writing in her journal since before Phineas knew her, and she had always been articulate and precise in her observations. And Thomas, who had been advocating for homesteaders' rights through his legal work for nearly a decade now, had been telling her for years that she should write down what she knew about the practical realities of homestead life for women in the Plains territories, because no one had done it from the inside and it needed doing. She wrote it over the course of 3 weeks in the evenings after the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp on and her journal open, writing in longhand. And she wrote it with the same directness and specificity that characterized everything else she did: the water measurements and the cattle records, and the letters to Thomas, and the conversations on the porch that September morning 10 years ago. She wrote about what it was to be a woman alone on a homestead in Kansas in the 1870s, about the legal vulnerabilities and the practical realities, and the particular combination of skill and stubbornness required, and about the systematic ways in which those vulnerabilities were exploited by land agents and unscrupulous buyers and county officials who had been captured by the interests of large landowners. Thomas submitted it to a newspaper in Topeka that was sympathetic to homesteaders' issues, and they published it in September of 1888, and it was read by several thousand people, and reprinted in 2 other papers, and generated a letter to the editor from Aldous Crew that was so defensive and self-incriminating that Thomas framed a copy of it and hung it in his office where it made him happy every day. Evelyn received 37 letters in response to the piece from women across Kansas and neighboring territories who recognized their own situations in what she had described. She answered every letter, carefully and specifically, because she did not do things carelessly. Phineas helped her answer them in the evenings, and he found it one of the most meaningful things he had been part of, this correspondence, these 37 women and the ones who wrote after them, being told by someone who knew it exactly that what they were experiencing was real and that there were things that could be done. Ray, at 9 years old, was aware that his mother had written something important because the letters had come and because his father had said so, and he asked to have it read to him, which she did, and he listened with the concentrated attention he gave to things that were important. And when she finished, he sat for a moment and then said, "That's what happened to us, before Papa came." "Yes," Evelyn said, "exactly that. But Papa came," Ray said. "He did," Evelyn said, and looked across the table at Phineas in the way she had been looking at him for 10 years, with the full and specific clarity that was her particular way of seeing things, which he had been grateful for every day since the first time it was directed at him. "He came to see about the land," Ray said. "He had heard the story in various forms over the years. And then he stayed." "He stayed," Evelyn said. "Yes." The autumn of 1888 had the particular quality that the best autumns have on the plains, when the sky is enormous and high and deeply blue, and the grass has gone its deep gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek are blazing yellow, and the air has that clarity that comes with the first cold edge, and everything is finished and stored and prepared for what comes next, and there is a brief period of equilibrium between the abundance of harvest and the austerity of winter. And in that equilibrium, the world is more fully itself than at any other time. They were all on the porch in such an afternoon, the whole family, Phineas and Evelyn in the 2 chairs, and Ray on the steps with a piece of leather harness. He was oiling with the focused competence of a boy who has been taught to take care of things, and Clara reading in the porch's corner with the absorption of a child who reads the way other people breathe, and George, a year old, sitting in the patch of sun at the edge of the porch, and examining a pebble with the dedicated attention of someone to whom pebbles are still remarkable, which they should always remain. Cornet was in the pasture, old and gray and unhurried, moving across the grass in the afternoon sun, and the 35 cattle were visible in the distance on the east pasture, and the apple trees on the northeast acres were heavy and red and gold, and the smell of the cider operation came faintly from the tool shed, sweet and fermenting and entirely specific to this place and this season. Evelyn was looking at all of it with the expression she had had since the day Phineas first saw her, the expression that looked like stillness but was actually motion, was actually the constant active process of seeing and assessing and understanding the land and the life she had made on it. Phineas watched her watching it. "What are you thinking?" he said. She turned to look at him. "I'm thinking," she said, "about the price of things." "What price?" She was quiet for a moment. Ray looked up from the harness briefly, curious, and then returned to his oiling, which was a courtesy. "You came here once with a price in your pocket," she said. "A number for this land, and I said no, and you said the number was wrong anyway, which was the first honest thing you did and the beginning of everything." "It was," he said. "I've been thinking about what I offered you," she said. "After that, what I offered you that you could not have put a number on. Coffee and the truth and help with the water case and the letters and the supper and the years. You offered me everything that mattered," he said. "I didn't know I was offering it at the time," she said. "I was just living my life and I let you into it, but it turned out to be the thing you needed, and you needed it as much as I needed what you brought." "Which was honesty," she said. "From a man who didn't have to be honest, who was paid specifically to be otherwise and chose differently. That was what I needed. Not the legal help, not the water rights, though those mattered. The honesty. Someone who saw this place clearly and said it was worth what it was worth." He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the October afternoon on the porch of the house she had been born to keep, and the land ran out before them in all its plain, enormous gold, and the children were around them in the particular beautiful chaos of children who are where they belong. "You offered me something I had no price for," he said. "I didn't have a category for it. I had a number for $420, and I had a company's interest, and I had the habit of seeing land as a calculation. You offered me a life, a real one. You were already ready for it," she said. "I could see that on the first morning. Could you? You took off your hat," she said, "and you meant it. You weren't taking off your hat because the instruction manual said to. You did it because that was who you were." He thought about that morning, about Cornet and the rising dust and the document in his breast pocket, and the woman in the doorway with the rifle that was not pointed at him but could have been, and how everything that was his life now had been entirely absent from that morning and entirely implicit in it, waiting in the future like the apples in the orchard, like the children on the porch, like the water running clean in the creek. George had fallen asleep in his patch of sun with the pebble still in his fist. Clara had not moved her eyes from her book for 20 minutes. Ray had finished the harness and was now just sitting on the steps looking at the prairie with the faraway attentive look that meant he was thinking something large and was working up to an opinion about it. "Papa," Ray said. "Yes." "How much does this place cost, the whole of it?" Phineas considered the question. "You can't really put a number on it," he said. "Not an accurate one." Ray turned back to look at the prairie, apparently satisfied with this answer. "That's what I thought," he said. The evening came down over the prairie in the way Kansas evenings come in autumn, slowly, and with a quality of golden red that is unlike any light anywhere else, painting the grass and the distant line of the creek cottonwoods in a color that is only available for 20 minutes and is different every day. Evelyn went inside to start supper, and Phineas followed to help, and Ray came in carrying George, who had woken up when the sun moved off him and was now fully alert and opinionated about the direction of travel, and Clara came in with her finger in her book to mark the page. The kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of supper, the fire in the cook-stove and the good smell of the beans and the cornbread and the coffee on the back of the stove, and the lamp came on as it always did in the evenings, as it had since before Phineas first sat at this table, as it would continue to do for as long as there was someone here to light it. They sat down together, and Evelyn passed the bread, and Ray described, at considerable length, something that had happened with the youngest calf that morning, and Clara offered a more precise version of the same events, and George banged his spoon on the table in a rhythm that meant nothing in particular and everything in general. And outside, the Kansas evening completed its magnificent brief performance and was replaced by a darkness that was clear and cold and full of stars. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat by the fire the way they had sat by fires together for 9 years of evenings, and the coals were orange, and the lamplight was warm, and Evelyn had her journal open on her knee, though she was not writing in it at the moment, just holding it the way she held things she had made and meant to keep. "Another good year," she said. "Yes," he said. "Another good year." She looked at him across the firelight with those gray-green eyes that he had never stopped finding astonishing, and what was in them was everything that had been built between them. The Creekwater survey and the letters and the porch conversations and the February mornings, breaking ice from the water troughs and the children and the orchard trees and the winters and the good springs and the ordinary evenings, and the specific weight of a life that had been chosen deliberately and worked for honestly. "Phineas Finley," she said. "Evelyn Mercer Finley," he said. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I can calculate." "Good," she said. "Some things should exceed calculation." The fire settled into the grate, releasing a brief flame and then returning to its steady glow, and the Kansas night was vast and quiet around the house, and the homestead sat on its 190 acres of bottom land, the way it had always sat, solid and specific and entirely its own, and the lamp burned in the window the way it had burned every evening since long before anyone named Phineas Finley had ridden up the lane in the autumn dust. And the stars above the Kansas plains, which had watched all of this without comment, continued their ancient and indifferent rotation, and the creek ran in the dark, clear and full, as it had run and would run, and the apple trees on the northeast acres stood in the cold with their harvest all gathered in, and their roots deep in the good bottom land, resting before the long patience of winter and the certain return of spring.